From the shifting shadows of imagination to the blinding light of terror, this is One Tale to Midnight.
The thrill of solitude has always been my elixir. The feel of crisp, untouched wilderness beneath my boots, the murmur of wind weaving tales through the trees, and the unseen wildlife rustling just out of sight. These were the sounds and sensations that kept my spirit alive. My passion for exploring the unmapped corners of the world was unyielding. So when I heard whispers of an obscure remote valley nestled somewhere in New Mexico's labyrinth of rocky terrain, I didn't hesitate. The promise of silence and untamed nature called to me, urging me to embark on a 3-week camping adventure. The first few days passed like a blissful dream. The sky stretched endlessly above, painted with sun-drenched clouds during the day and peppered with a million stars at night. My hikes were challenging, the terrain jagged and unpredictable, but I was in my element. I charted new paths, jotted notes in my weathered journal, and felt the tension of my everyday life melt away with each step. It was on the 5th day that I discovered the valley. Unlike the rest of the terrain, it wasn't on any map. Hidden by sharp cliffs and choked with thorny underbrush, it would have been easy to miss. But something, a glint of sunlight on the rocks or the subtle shift of shadows, drew me in. I descended carefully, sliding and grasping at rough edges, until I found myself standing at the base, surrounded by walls of stone that loomed high above like ancient sentinels. The place exuded an eerie tranquility. No chirping crickets or birdsong broke the silence. It was as if the entire world held its breath. I should have taken it as a sign, but curiosity gripped me harder than caution ever could. That first night, I set up camp in the center of the valley. The fire crackled to life, casting long, shivering shadows against the rock faces. As I stared into the flames, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were studying me. I shook off the feeling and settled into my sleeping bag. The silence that once comforted me now pressed against my ears with an unnatural weight. And then I heard it, soft, like the wind hissing through dry grass, whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs weaving in and out of the stillness. I bolted upright, heart pounding as I strained to listen. The whispers faded as quickly as they had come, leaving me questioning whether I'd imagined them. With a nervous laugh, I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks. The second night was different. The whispers began as soon as the sun disappeared behind the craggy peaks. This time they were louder, less like the wind and more like voices, secretive and urgent. I spun around, searching the dark, but the only light came from my dwindling fire. My eyes darted to the hills above, and that's when I saw them, glowing yellow orbs shifting and darting just beyond the reach of the firelight. Eyes watching, waiting. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed closer to the fire, gripping my hunting knife until my knuckles turned white. I didn't sleep that night. The eyes vanished when the first sliver of dawn crept over the horizon, but the whispers stayed with me, swirling like a dark promise. By the 3rd day, fear gnawed at my resolve. I packed my gear in frantic haste, determined to leave this accursed valley behind. But as I began my climb out, I noticed something strange. The landscape had changed. Paths I had confidently mapped out now twisted and doubled back on themselves, turning my route into an impossible maze. The sun blazed high overhead, but it offered no comfort. Only the taunting realization that I was trapped. When night fell again, I abandoned my tent and built the biggest fire I could, a desperate ward against the eyes and voices. I sat with my back to the flames, eyes darting to every shadow. The whispers were a constant hum now, surrounding me like a malevolent choir. Then, with a sudden rush, a cold wind surged down the valley, snuffing out my fire and sending me scrambling for shelter. I found a crevasse, a narrow slit in the rock where I could squeeze in just enough to shield my back. But the moment I pressed myself into the shadows, my heart plummeted. The glowing eyes were no longer distant. They were here, within the crevasse, gleaming in dark, human-like shapes. Figures crawled along the rock walls, their movements jerky and insect-like, limbs bending in ways that defied nature. My pulse drummed in my ears, drowning out the whispers that had grown louder, frenzied. Too distracted by the looming shapes, I almost missed the shifting ground beneath my boots. The dirt began to sink, slowly at first, then with an alarming speed, pulling me down. I flailed, hands scrabbling for purchase as the rock scraped my palms raw. My feet dangled into an unseen void, the ground consuming me inch by inch. Then came the red mist. It seeped from the earth thick and suffocating, swirling around me until it filled every breath. It burned my eyes and clogged my throat, turning the whispers into a deafening roar. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The figures in the crevasse tilted their heads in unison, as if curious, before creeping closer. Panic coursed through me, an icy wave that left me trembling and weak. I reached for the jagged edges of the crevasse, fingers slick with blood, muscles straining as I fought against the pull of the earth. The whispers grew into a cacophony, words finally breaking through. The voice was deep and guttural, resonating with a cadence that bypassed my ears and seemed to rattle the very marrow of my bones. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning. An incantation, a curse, or perhaps an invocation meant to call something from the depths of the earth. Panic surged through me as the crimson mist thickened, turning the air sharp and metallic. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was struggle against the walls of the crevasse that now felt more like a tomb. The shadows continued their erratic dance, yellow eyes glistening with something that resembled hunger. The whispers, those relentless whispers, rose into a terrible wail that drowned out my pounding heartbeat. Desperation propelled me to move. I dug my fingers into the crevasse walls, clawing at the jagged edges in search of a foothold. My hands bled freely, leaving dark smears on the rock that the red mist seemed to absorb. Inch by inch, I hoisted myself out of the hole, muscles screaming with exhaustion, until I managed to collapse on a narrow ledge. I lay there, gasping for air that tasted faintly of rust and decay, my limbs quaking uncontrollably. The valley below was awash with that same crimson hue, pulsing like a living, breathing entity. The dark figures had gathered at the base of the crevasse, their forms now more distinct. They were gaunt and twisted, their skin a slick obsidian black that shimmered when the mist licked across it. Their eyes remained the only source of light, a hellish yellow that promised suffering. I pushed myself up, my body a trembling wreck. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, to find a way out of this living nightmare. But as I backed away, one of the figures turned its head toward me, its neck cracking like dry wood. It opened its mouth, a slit filled with needle-like teeth, and let out a sound that made my blood freeze. A sound that echoed with all the hopelessness I felt in that moment. They began to climb. Spindly limbs reached for the walls of the crevasse, hauling their bodies upward with an unnatural grace. I had no choice but to ascend. My fingers found purchase on the uneven rock as I scrambled upward, my back muscles knotting with every frantic pull. Below, the figures advanced, their climb effortless, as if gravity bent to their will. I reached the rim of the crevasse and threw myself over it, landing hard on my side. Pain flared through my ribs, but adrenaline drove me to my feet. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams that filled the night, each one speaking a language I didn't know but understood with a primal certainty. Run, run, while you can. With my camp forgotten, I sprinted toward the labyrinthine paths that had led me to this hellish place. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, each step taking me deeper into the valley rather than out of it. The eyes followed, appearing and disappearing like ghostly lanterns in the dark, guiding me further into their domain. Time lost meaning, hours, days. It was all a blur of darkness, blood, and the sound of my own ragged breathing. At some point, the crimson mist receded, leaving only silence and a sky that was somehow darker than before. Exhausted, I dropped to my knees, realizing I had reached a small clearing at the heart of the valley. The air was cold and heavy, pressing down on me like the weight of 1,000 stones. The ground was smoother here, carved with symbols I didn't recognize, and at the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone monolith. It rose at least 20 feet into the air, etched with strange markings that seemed to glow with an internal fire. I staggered toward it, drawn by a force I couldn't resist, and pressed my hand against its surface. The stone was warm, pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't my own. A sudden silence fell over the valley, so deep that even my labored breathing seemed sacrilegious. The figures had stopped their pursuit, standing at the edge of the clearing like sentinels. Their eyes were now fixed on me, but they didn't move. The voice spoke again, this time from within me. It reverberated in my skull, dragging its barbed syllables across my mind. You have seen, you have called. Now, you will be one of us. The symbols on the monolith flared to life, their glow shifting from deep red to a blinding white. Pain lanced through my hand, searing up my arm and into my chest. I screamed. A sound ripped from the core of my being as the light consumed me, filling my vision, my thoughts, and every fiber of who I was. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the yellow eyes surrounding me, blinking in unison as they stepped forward, their whispers turning to a chorus of twisted laughter. When consciousness returned, it did so reluctantly, pulling me from the depths of a dark, dreamless void. My eyelids were heavy as lead, and each attempt to open them felt like tearing through layers of cobwebs clinging to my mind. The first sensation that pierced through the haze was the biting cold of the stone beneath me, smooth and etched with grooves that cut into my skin. I forced my eyes open, squinting against the dim light that now bathed the valley. The monolith still stood before me, but its glow had faded to a dull, sickly red pulsating like a dying ember. The figures, those dark, grotesque things with eyes that burned yellow, had vanished. A stillness settled over the clearing, oppressive and wrong like the silence that follows a scream. I sat up, every muscle in my body aching with a deep, bone-weary fatigue. My left hand throbbed, and when I looked down, I saw the source of the pain. A dark mark had been seared into my palm, a jagged symbol that twisted and coiled like living ink. It glistened wetly, a brand that radiated heat and sent shivers up my spine. I touched it, and a wave of nausea rolled through me, the mark pulsing as if responding to my touch. Panic clawed at the edges of my sanity as I struggled to piece together what had happened. Memories of whispers, eyes, and the terrible voice clawed their way back, but they felt distant now, shrouded by the fog that still clung to my thoughts. The valley looked the same as it had before, the same jagged rock walls and sparse, twisted trees, but it felt different, suffocating, like the very air was watching me. I stood, my legs shaking beneath me, and turned slowly in a circle. The path I had taken down into the valley was gone, replaced by a landscape that seemed both familiar and alien. The rocks had shifted, and the crevices and shadows took on forms that suggested movement just out of sight. I knew I had to leave this place, but every direction felt wrong, as if taking a single step would bring me deeper into the valley's clutches. With no clear path, I chose the direction opposite the monolith, hoping it would lead me out. My feet shuffled forward, the ground beneath them grinding with a low, mournful groan. Each step felt like it was being resisted, the air thickening, pressing against my chest. I glanced back once, and the monolith seemed to watch me, the glow of its runes flickering, as if laughing at my futile attempt to escape. Time passed in a blur as I wandered through the maze of rocks and thorny scrub, each turn leading to dead ends or paths that twisted back on themselves. The sun never seemed to rise. The sky remained a bruised shade of twilight that cast long, grotesque shadows. My throat was dry, the taste of iron still on my tongue, and my head throbbed with an ache that pulsed in time with the brand on my palm. I don't know how long I wandered before the whispers started again. Soft and teasing at first. They came from everywhere and nowhere, whispering my name in a cadence that mimicked the wind. I quickened my pace, trying to drown them out with the sound of my boots crunching against gravel, but they only grew louder, multiplying until the air buzzed with their insidious chatter. You cannot leave. The voice sliced through the whispers, a command that stopped me in my tracks. My heart hammered as I turned slowly, half expecting to see one of the shadow figures standing behind me. Instead, the ground shivered beneath my feet, and the crimson mist seeped up through the cracks, coiling around my ankles like living chains. Fear surged through me, and I wrenched my feet free, stumbling back. The mist followed, creeping and clawing its way toward me, bringing with it the same metallic tang that had filled the air before. My pulse quickened as the whispers turned to laughter, a cacophony of voices that seemed to mock my every movement. "You belong to us now." He brand on my palm seared with fresh pain, sending waves of heat radiating up my arm. I gasped, falling to my knees as the mist enveloped me, its touch icy and suffocating. I struggled, clawing at the ground, but my limbs felt sluggish, as if they were moving through water. The world spun, the edges of my vision darkening, narrowing to a tunnel, and then I saw them, eyes. Hundreds of yellow eyes, blinking and staring from the edges of the mist, each one filled with a sick, eager light. The figures emerged again, their gaunt forms swaying as they approached. They reached for me with long, skeletal fingers, their jagged smiles stretching too wide as they whispered promises I couldn't comprehend. "Accept your fate." The last word echoed in my mind as the red mist surged upward, pulling me under with a force that tore the air from my lungs. I tried to scream, but no sound came. Darkness swallowed me whole, and the last thing I felt was the heat of the brand pulsing in rhythm with the terrible heartbeat of the valley. I awoke to silence, the kind so complete that it was deafening. My eyes fluttered open, and for a moment I thought I had died. The red mist was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that clung to the air like an invisible shroud. The sky above was dark, a black void devoid of stars or moon, and the ground beneath me was cold, smooth, and unfamiliar. Slowly I sat up, my body aching as if I'd been crushed under a great weight. The brand on my palm still throbbed with a dull heat, and when I looked at it, the symbol had darkened to an inky black, embedded deep into my skin. It was no longer wet or fresh, but the sight of it filled me with a sense of dread so profound that it felt like a stone in my gut. The landscape had changed. The jagged cliffs and rocks that had once formed the valley were gone, replaced by an expanse of flat stone that stretched as far as I could see. The air was heavy, pressing against my skin and filling my lungs with a metallic taste that never quite faded. In the distance, a faint light flickered, a beacon in the endless darkness. It was the only thing that broke the monotony of this barren wasteland. With no other choice, I pushed myself to my feet and began to walk toward the light. Each step echoed in the silence, a sharp contrast to the relentless whispers that had haunted me before. The flat stone beneath me was etched with faint patterns that seemed to shift and change when I looked away, like living things dancing just beyond the edge of my vision. As I neared the light, I saw that it emanated from a fire, small and flickering, surrounded by figures cloaked in shadows. They stood in a circle, unmoving, their faces hidden beneath hoods. My heart raced as I approached, my mind screaming at me to turn back, but my body moved forward as if drawn by an unseen force. The figures did not react to my presence, remaining as still as statues as I stepped into their circle. The fire in the center cast a weak glow that barely reached their faces, illuminating eyes that were cold and unfeeling. The whispers returned, rising from their mouths without movement, seeping into the air like smoke. "You have been marked." The voice was unified, deep and resonant, blending with the sound of the fire crackling. I looked down at my palm, the brand now glowing with the same crimson hue as the fire. Panic bubbled up inside me, and I took a step back, only to find that the figures had closed ranks around me, trapping me within their circle. "Why?" I croaked, my voice raw and ragged. "What do you want from me?" The tallest figure, standing directly across the fire, tilted its head. The motion was slow, deliberate, and filled with an unnatural grace. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of many, a blend of voices, both male and female, old and young. "You ventured where none are meant to go. You awoke what was forgotten." The fire flared, and I shielded my eyes as heat blasted across my face. When I lowered my arm, the figures had changed. Their hoods were gone, revealing faces that were a patchwork of human and not. Some had eyes that glowed like the ones that had haunted me from the hills. Others had mouths filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. One had no face at all, just a smooth plane of skin where features should have been. "You bear the mark of the Seeker," the figure continued. Now, you must decide. Accept your fate or be consumed. The weight of their words pressed down on me, suffocating and unrelenting. The mark on my palm burned hotter, and I clenched my fist to dull the pain. Memories of the valley, the eyes, and the whispers surged back, a tide of terror that threatened to pull me under. What fate? I shouted, desperation cracking my voice. What am I supposed to do? The fire flickered, and the faces around me broke into smiles, wide and unnatural. The tallest figure stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I could see the thin, pulsating veins beneath its translucent skin. You will seek, you will guide, or you will be one with the mist. Before I could react, the figure reached out and pressed its cold, clawed hand against my chest. Pain exploded through me, and the world around me disintegrated into a maelstrom of crimson light and dark whispers. I screamed as the ground fell away, and I was swallowed by the mist once more, my body weightless, spiraling through an endless void. When I landed, it was with a jolt that drove the air from my lungs. The ground was familiar again, jagged and unforgiving. The sky was no longer a void, but a storm of rolling clouds painted in violent shades of red and black. The wind howled around me, carrying with it the voices of the figures, now distant but ever present. I was back in the valley, but everything had changed. The monolith stood in the distance, glowing brighter than before, its runes twisting and writhing as if alive. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, woven into the fabric of the air. I looked at my palm, now throbbing with a steady, unyielding heat. The symbol pulsed, and with it I felt an unearthly pull toward the monolith, a compulsion I couldn't resist. The whispers returned, no longer menacing but instructive, guiding me forward. I understood now. I had been marked, chosen, bound to something far older and darker than I could have imagined. And as I stepped toward the monolith, the last vestiges of who I was began to slip away, replaced by a new purpose: to seek, to guide, and to serve the will of the valley. Each step toward the monolith felt like a surrender. The whispers intensified, now not just a chorus but a melody, haunting and beautiful, weaving through my thoughts and drawing me forward. My hand, branded with the living mark, glowed in unison with the runes carved into the monolith. I was no longer just an observer in this strange world. I was connected to it, a vessel carrying something that defied comprehension. As I neared the towering stone, I saw that its glow pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The runes danced across its surface, rearranging themselves into patterns that spoke in a language only my subconscious understood. My fingers twitched as I reached out, compelled to touch the monolith, to close the circle that had begun when I first entered this cursed valley. The moment my palm met the cold, rough stone, a jolt of energy surged through me. It wasn't pain this time, but something deeper, resonant and overpowering. The air hummed, vibrating with a force that set my teeth on edge. The whispers swelled into a crescendo, each voice distinct yet part of a greater whole. They spoke not in words but in feelings, impressions that flooded my mind in waves. Visions flared behind my eyes, a world covered in crimson mist, shadow figures crawling from the cracks of the earth, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The valley stretched beyond the confines of New Mexico, spreading into the heart of the world, a cancerous vein that pulsed with dark life. And at the center of it all stood the monolith, ancient and sentient, a beacon calling its children home. I pulled my hand back, panting and shaking, but the connection was made. The runes on the stone burned with a light so intense it felt as though it could sear my skin from bone. The brand on my palm blazed, and I fell to my knees, unable to look away as the monolith began to shift and groan, its surface cracking and splitting open to reveal a chasm that radiated crimson light. From within the chasm something stirred, a deep primal rumble that resonated in my chest. The mist poured out, swirling like a tempest, and in its center, a shape began to take form. Tall and humanoid but wrong, twisted and angular as if it had been carved by a deranged sculptor. Its eyes opened first, two orbs of molten gold that pierced through the mist and found me, pinning me in place. I should have felt fear, but what gripped me was awe. This was not just a creature, it was a force, something ancient and eternal. It spoke without speaking, its thoughts pressing into my mind, filling it with knowledge that burned like wildfire. You are the herald, the seeker, the one who will open the way. The title echoed within me, solidifying a truth I hadn't wanted to accept. The brand on my palm was not just a mark. It was a key, one that had now turned, unlocking something I could never hope to control. The ground quaked and fissures splintered out from the monolith, glowing with the same red light that surrounded me. I tried to back away, but the mist coiled around my legs, holding me fast. The figure stepped out of the chasm, its movements fluid and predatory. It reached out, its elongated fingers brushing my face, and I flinched as a shock of cold lanced through me. It wasn't just touching me, it was binding itself to me, its will entwining with mine. Suddenly, the whispers were no longer outside me. They were inside, part of my thoughts, a chorus that resonated in harmony with my heartbeat. I gasped as visions flooded my mind, entire cities swallowed by crimson mist, forests turned to blackened husks, and people, so many people, standing motionless, eyes blank and mouths open in silent screams. "You will guide them here, Herald," the figure said, its voice smooth and serpentine, "and when the world bows before us, the old order will fall, and we will rise." I didn't know what "we" meant, but I felt it, deep in my soul. The essence of the valley, the mist, and the shadow figures were now part of me. I stumbled back as the figure released its hold, the mist receding just enough to let me fall. My breathing came in ragged gasps, my body trembling as the realization hit me. I had opened the way. The monolith sealed itself shut, the cracks smoothing over until it stood as it had before, silent and watchful. The crimson light dimmed, but it didn't disappear. It pulsed gently, like a heart at rest, waiting for the moment to beat stronger again. I stood shakily, my vision swimming, and looked down at my branded palm. The symbol glowed faintly, no longer a searing pain but a quiet reminder of what I now was. The whispers had faded to the back of my mind, a subtle presence that I knew would never leave. I looked out over the valley, the air thick with anticipation, and understood what I needed to do. I was no longer just an outdoorsman, lost and afraid. I was the herald, the one chosen to bring the world to the edge of something unspeakable. And as I took my first step toward the unknown, the whispers welcomed me home.